Hey guys, and welcome to my channel. We've got a really interesting case in our hands today, and I'm sure you will have a lot of feelings about it, just like I did. And rightfully so. To many people, filicide is the worst crime a person can commit. It's deeply confusing. Why would anybody hurt the person they brought into this world, the one they're supposed to protect with their own life? But then again, we've all heard names like Chris Watts or Andrea Yates, and whenever a new case like this surfaces, people ask themselves why. After all, there are so many options that don't involve hurting your child. How can anyone be the reason for their child's last breath? Let's dive in. Constance Margaret Surroy was born on March 26th of 1929 in Oakland, Maine. She did not have it easy from the get-go, as she was abandoned shortly after her birth. Fate smiled at her as she was quickly adopted, but unfortunately, being part of a family did not last long. By the time Constance was 5, both of her adoptive parents passed away, and she was once again thrown back into the foster system. Eventually, Constance ended up living with another foster family, but quite tragically, the foster parents have been through extreme hardships themselves, as they have lost a few of their children in infancy. It seems that despite her young age, Constance was faced with the idea of death numerous times. When she was 17, she married a 24-year-old Carl Marion Fisher, a World War II vet who found employment as a mechanic. The newlyweds settled in a Maine town called Waterville, with the hopes of creating a peaceful life for themselves and their children. Shortly after, the couple welcomed their first child, Richard, who was born in 1947. After that came Daniel and Deborah. Even though technically Constance got what she has always longed for, she was deeply struggling with the feelings of anxiety and depression. Those feelings were only made worse by the fact that Carl was not earning enough money to provide for the family. The place they were living in was small and cramped, with Constance's mental state deteriorating further. Only 1 year later, in 1954, Constance was starting to consider the unthinkable. At this point, she had been struggling with postpartum psychosis that has now turned into a full-blown psychosis. She was convinced that God was speaking to her, advising her the children need to be saved from evil. The incident took place while Carl was at work. One after the other, she took the lives of her 3, 2, and 1-year-old by drowning them in the bathtub, after which she tried to take her own life by ingesting shampoo. When Carl was telling the police about the incident, he said that when he first came home, the door was locked. He was immediately worried, as his wife didn't usually lock the door, so he reached out to Dr. Richard Schass, who was in charge of his wife's treatment. Together, they forced their way inside. Carl explained that he first entered the bedroom, where he found Daniel and Deborah lying in their beds. At this point, he had no idea the children were no longer alive. They looked asleep. Right after, he went into the bathroom, where he discovered his eldest son, Richard, drowned. Despite looking for Constance, he was not able to locate her and called for an ambulance. Unfortunately, it was far too late, as the children had been gone for hours. Once the authorities arrived, they found Constance unconscious under the bed, likely due to poisoning herself with the shampoo. Not too far away was a note explaining she did it in order to save them. It was quickly determined Constance was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia and therefore unfit to stand trial. And we've seen situations like these, with the most familiar example being Andrea Yates. For those of you who need a bit of a refresher, Andrea Yates was a woman who in June of 2001 drowned all of her 5 children in a bathtub. The youngest child was only 6 months old, the oldest 7. At first, the jury did not take her mental state into consideration and believed her diagnosis of postpartum psychosis was not enough to warrant a more lenient sentence, which is why she was sentenced to life in prison, with the ability to apply for parole after 40 years. After a few years, that sentence was overturned, and her insanity plea was accepted. Reportedly, she's still at a high-security hospital to this date and is not trying to plead for freedom as she feels guilty for what she's done to her children. But back to the case at hand. Similarly to Yates, Constance was not found guilty by reason of insanity. As punishment, she was sentenced to 5 years in a state psychiatric hospital in Maine. Personally, I was quite surprised to read that insanity plea was a widely known defense back in the 1950s, as well as the fact that the jury recognized Fisher's crime as something that was born out of a mental health break, as opposed to being evil or whatever you used to say whenever women acted out of ordinary back then. Once her sentence was up, 5 years later, she was released back home to her husband. It's also pretty extraordinary that her husband stood by her side throughout the whole ordeal and was supportive of his wife despite her actions. Clearly, the Fishers were not wasting any time, as their 4th child, Kathleen, was born less than a year after Constance was released. I wasn't able to find as to whether or not she was able to get further psychiatric help or medication in order to manage her symptoms, but the Fishers didn't just stop at one child. 2 years later, in 1962, Constance and her husband welcomed their next baby, Michael, with Natalie joining the family in 1965. I'm sure everyone can predict what happened next, thanks to the title of this video, and the terrible incident took place on June 30th of 1966. The circumstances were eerily similar to what happened the first time. John, upon coming home from work and not hearing anyone inside the house, started looking for Constance and the children. The first body he came upon was the one belonging to the 9-month-old Natalie. She suffered a fate similar to that of her late siblings, as John found her lifeless body floating in the tub. Since the Fishers didn't have a phone, John ran over to his neighbors to call the police. The other 2 children, as well as Constance, were found in the bed. Once again, her attempt at taking her life was unsuccessful. Her plan of overdosing on pills didn't work as she woke up after being transported to the hospital. In the aftermath of the crime, Constance was ordered by the court to undergo a psychiatric evaluation. Doctors declared her mentally competent to stand trial, and soon she faced charges for the murders of her 3 young children. When the indictment was read in court, Constance broke down in tears, pleading not guilty by reason of insanity. During the proceedings, prosecutors brought in witnesses like Captain Albert Dross from the Waterville Police and Dr. Joseph Hebel of their hospital. Both testified that Constance had given calm, coherent answers during their questioning, and Dross revealed he'd found a gun and a knife in the family home, which Constance allegedly planned to use to end her own life. Despite these details, her defense team successfully argued that she was legally insane at the time of the killings. The judge ultimately ruled that she should spend the rest of her life confined to the state hospital. For years, Constance kept a low profile inside the hospital walls, until everything changed on October 1st of 1973. That day, her husband Carl, overwhelmed by grief, decided to stop visiting her. Soon after, Constance quietly escaped from the hospital, sparking a desperate search by staff and local police. Days later, on October 9th, duck hunters spotted her body floating in the Kennebec River near Gardner. An autopsy concluded she had drowned, likely on the very day she fled. In the end, she was laid to rest in the family's burial plot in Waterville, later joined by her husband Carl and their 6 children, leaving behind a haunting legacy of tragedy and loss. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate you being here, and I'd be really curious to see what do you think we should implement as a society in order to see these cases go down in numbers. And also, how do you think these cases, once they occur, how do you think they should be dealt with? Again, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.